I stared at the final divorce decree, the elegant script declaring the end of 15 years together, the document that Richard believed had left me with nothing but my clothes and personal effects. His signature was bold, triumphant, the flourish of a man who thought he'd won. I took a sip from my crystal glass, rare Macallan warming my throat as I gazed over Boston's skyline from my penthouse window. The one he didn't know existed. The one purchased through my holding company 3 years earlier when I first discovered his betrayal. The text from my lawyer came exactly at 4:30 p.m. It's done. The divorce is finalized. He's taken the bait entirely. I smiled, setting my phone on the Italian marble countertop. Richard always underestimated me. What he didn't know was that my refusal to sign that prenup 15 years ago wasn't naivete, it was strategy. The divorce decree felt cold in my hands, its legal jargon declaring the end of 15 years of marriage in sterile, unfeeling language. I traced my finger over Richard's signature, bold and triumphant, the flourish of a man who believed he had won everything. I took a slow sip of 30-year-old Macallan from my crystal tumbler, savoring the warm spice as it slid down my throat. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, Boston's skyline glittered in the twilight, the lights coming alive as darkness fell. Richard had no idea this place existed, purchased through my holding company 3 years earlier. When I first discovered his betrayal, my phone chimed with a text from Harold, my attorney. It's done. Divorce finalized. He's taken the bait entirely. I smiled, setting the phone down on the Italian marble countertop. The same rare Calicotta Viola marble that Richard had once declared too extravagant for our home renovation. The irony wasn't lost on me. Richard always underestimated me. From the moment we met at that biotech conference in San Francisco, he saw only what he wanted to see: the supportive wife, the charming hostess for his business dinners, the woman content to stand in his shadow. He never bothered to remember that before we met. I had already made my first 100 million in genetic sequencing technology, that I spoke 4 languages and had built and sold 3 companies before I turned 32, that I had quietly advised the venture capital firm that gave him his first major break. To him, I was arm candy who got lucky, an ornament who should be grateful. His text from this morning still burned on my phone screen. The movers will be at the house tomorrow to collect anything of value. Don't bother arguing about the art collection. The appraisals all happened without your knowledge. The prenup you refused would have helped you here. Too bad. Good luck starting over at 42. The prenup he mentioned, the one I stubbornly refused to sign 15 years ago, was actually his first miscalculation. What he didn't know was that my refusal wasn't born from naivete or romantic delusion. It was strategic, without a prenup. The exposure was mutual. It gave me room to maneuver, to watch, to plan. And plan I did. I walked across the living room, my bare feet silent against the heated floor, and opened what appeared to be a simple bookshelf. Behind it, a hidden panel concealed a secure monitor that illuminated with a soft blue glow. I pressed my palm against the scanner and entered a 16-digit code. The screen came to life, displaying the current balance: 5.1 billion. Not bad for a woman who, according to the divorce papers, was leaving her marriage with no significant assets or means of support. The bitter truth Richard never grasped was that our marriage had been over for me 3 years earlier, the night I found the hidden correspondence. The offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, the evidence that he had been systematically hiding assets and preparing for an exit, presumably with Victoria, his marketing director. I could have confronted him then, could have raged and screamed and filed for divorce immediately, but emotion makes for poor strategy, and I wasn't about to let 15 years end with me receiving whatever scraps his lawyers deemed appropriate. Instead, I began my own parallel plan, one that would ensure when the inevitable happened, I would not be the victim of his narrative. The first thing I did was reconnect with my old mentor, Margaret. At 76, she was still one of the sharpest financial minds in the industry and had never quite approved of Richard. He's got hungry eyes, she'd told me at our wedding. Not ambitious hungry, desperate hungry, the kind that's never satisfied. She was right. Of course, I met her at her brownstone in Beacon Hill, a place filled with first edition books and artifacts from her travels. The afternoon light streamed through tall windows as her housekeeper served us tea in delicate porcelain cups. "I've been waiting for this day," Margaret said simply, studying me over her reading glasses. "For about 12 years, if I'm being honest." I raised an eyebrow. "That long? Jennifer, I've known you since you were a brilliant but naive 24-year-old with your first startup. I saw how you changed after marrying Richard, how you diminished yourself to fit his idea of what a wife should be." She set her cup down with a decisive clink. So, what's happened? I told her everything, the hidden accounts. Victoria, the exit strategy Richard had been planning. As I spoke, I felt a curious detachment, as if I were describing someone else's marriage. Margaret listened without interruption. When I finished, she removed her glasses and leaned forward. Jennifer, do you remember what I told you at your engagement party? I nodded. You said I was making a mistake. No, she corrected. I said you were playing a different game than he was. He was playing for control. You were playing for partnership. She sighed. The question now is, what game are you going to play next? I want what's rightfully mine, I said, and I want him to understand exactly who he underestimated. Margaret smiled, then a sharp, predatory expression I had never seen on her before. Then let's make sure he learns that lesson thoroughly. She pressed a button on her intercom. Send in the team, please. Within minutes, 3 people joined us: Harold Winters, a silver-haired attorney known for his work in complex financial litigation; Daniel Chen, a former cybersecurity specialist for the NSA; and Elizabeth Nolan, a financial strategist whose work in offshore structures had made her both admired and feared on Wall Street. This would be my war council. Before we begin, Margaret said, you should know that anything we discuss here stays here. The strategies we'll develop exist in a gray area legal. But aggressive? Are you prepared for that? I thought about Richard's text, his smug certainty that he had won. Absolutely. For the next 3 hours, we outlined the foundation of what would become my counter strategy. Harold explained the legal landscape, identifying vulnerabilities in Richard's approach. Daniel detailed how we could monitor Richard's communications legally, tracking his financial moves. Elizabeth sketched complex financial structures that would allow me to build wealth independent of our marital assets. The first rule of financial extrication, Elizabeth explained, drawing a diagram on Margaret's antique desk blotter, is to establish clean channels, no connections to existing accounts, no digital trails, nothing that could be monitored or traced. I needed seed capital money I could access without raising flags in Richard's elaborate monitoring systems. He tracked our joint accounts meticulously, his financial team producing monthly reports on every transaction. Any unusual movement would trigger immediate questions. The solution came from an unexpected source 6 years earlier. I had made a personal angel investment in a friend's medical device startup, $250,000 that Richard had dismissed as charity for your college friend. The company had since been acquired, and I was owed a payout of nearly $3.5 million. The acquisition paperwork had arrived while Richard was in London, and I had never mentioned it to him, my small act of financial rebellion. The check was scheduled to arrive the following week, made out to me personally. It wasn't much in the context of our overall wealth, but it was mine alone, and more importantly, it was clean, untraceable to our joint holdings and unknown to Richard's financial team. With this initial capital, I could begin building the infrastructure I would need. One more thing, Margaret said as our meeting concluded. You'll need eyes on Richard, someone discreet who can track his movements, his meetings, his indiscretions. I know just the person, Harold interjected. Benjamin Walsh, former FBI, now private, the best in the business for high net worth surveillance. I nodded, feeling a curious sense of calm. The path ahead was clear, difficult, complex, requiring absolute discretion, but clear. As I left Margaret's brownstone, stepping into the crisp autumn air, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: the exhilaration of taking action, of reclaiming agency. It was a small step, almost insignificant in the larger scheme, but it was mine. The next day, I met with Thomas Wakefield, my personal banker from before my marriage. We sat in an unmarked restaurant accessed through a high-end furniture showroom in the Back Bay area. He had aged well silver at the temples now, but the same sharp eyes and discreet manner I remembered. After brief pleasantries, I laid out what I needed: a new account completely separate from my married finances, with sophisticated privacy protections. No statements, no correspondence, digital access through secure channels only. May I ask, he began. I cut him off gently. You may not. The less you know, the better for both of us. He nodded, understanding immediately. I can arrange everything. The initial deposit, approximately $3.5 million, arriving next week. If he was surprised by the amount, he didn't show it. Thomas had always been the model of professional discretion. And your long-term financial objectives for these funds? I considered the question carefully. Growth is secondary. This is about creating separation and security, a financial firewall, if you will. He made a note in a small leather-bound book. I understand completely. I'll need a signature on several documents. He slid a folder across the table. These can be processed immediately. The account will be active by close of business today. I signed where indicated, using a slightly modified version of my signature, different enough from the one Richard would recognize, but still legally valid. There's one more thing, I said as I handed back the folder. I'll need introductions to certain specialist people who operate with absolute confidentiality. What areas of expertise? Corporate structure, international banking, asset protection. I paused. And someone who specializes in digital privacy. Thomas closed his notebook. I'll make the arrangements. The contacts will come through secure channels only. No names will be mentioned over any traceable communication. As we parted, he held my hand a moment longer than necessary, his expression serious. Jennifer, whatever you're planning, be careful. I'm being precisely as careful as needed, I replied. That afternoon, while Richard was supposedly in meetings, though his location tracking, which I had secretly enabled on his phone, showed him at the Mandarin Oriental Hotel, I made two more crucial moves. First, I visited a safe deposit box I had maintained at a different bank, one Richard knew nothing about where I stored certain personal documents, my original birth certificate, passport copies, family heirlooms too precious to leave in our home. I added the documentation from Thomas and a sealed envelope containing access codes to my new financial infrastructure. Second, I purchased a new laptop with cash at a busy electronics store in downtown Crossing, making sure to dress down in clothes Richard had never seen and wearing sunglasses despite the overcast day. I paid for 3 years of advanced VPN service and a suite of privacy software recommended by Daniel that evening. I powered up the new computer in a coffee shop far from our usual haunts. Using the secured connection, I created the first of what would become many shell companies. This one registered in Delaware under a name generated by an algorithm designed to appear utterly forgettable, Morgan Analytics LLC. Its ownership structure was deliberately obscured through a series of nominee directors and virtual office addresses. Its stated purpose was investment management, vague enough to justify virtually any financial activity. Within this innocuous-seeming entity, I built the first layer of what would eventually become my financial fortress. As I worked, a part of me wondered if I was overreacting, creating elaborate contingencies for a worst-case scenario that might never materialize. But another voice, clearer, colder, reminded me of the offshore accounts I had discovered, of Richard's methodical financial secrecy. He had been planning his exit strategy for years. Now I was planning mine. The difference was that mine would succeed. When I returned home that evening, I was different. The change wasn't visible. I wore the same carefully composed expression, asked the same polite questions about his day, performed the same role of supportive wife, but beneath that performance, something fundamental had shifted. I had taken the first step from reaction to action, from victim to strategist. That night, as Richard slept beside me, I lay awake planning the next moves in what I already understood would be a years-long campaign. The timeline would need to be precise. Moving too quickly would alert him. Too slowly would risk discovery. I would need to be patient, methodical, always several steps ahead. I had no illusions about the complexity of what I was undertaking. Extracting myself financially from our entangled lives would require extraordinary care. Building a separate fortune would demand both brilliance and discretion. But as I finally drifted towards sleep, I felt something that had been absent for too long purpose. And beneath that, something even more powerful, the absolute certainty that I would not only survive what was coming, but emerge victorious. The $3.5 million from my medical device investment arrived exactly as expected, a simple check made out to my maiden name. Delivered in an unmarked business envelope, I deposited it personally into my new account at First Cambridge Trust, watching as Thomas processed the transaction with his characteristic efficiency. "The funds will clear by tomorrow," he said, sliding a small encrypted drive across his desk. "This contains access credentials for your secure portal. The password protocol requires changes every 48 hours. But $3.5 million, while a start, was merely the spark. What I needed was a financial accelerant, something that could rapidly multiply my resources without triggering attention. Opportunity arrived 3 weeks later during our annual New Year's Gala at our Newton estate. The gathering was a calculated display of wealth and influence, 60 guests, all power players in finance and technology, brought together ostensibly for celebration but actually for deal-making. Midway through the evening, I overheard a conversation between two venture capitalists discussing a quantum computing startup called Nexus Quantum. The founder, a former DARPA scientist, had developed a breakthrough in qubit stability that would potentially solve the decoherence problem plaguing quantum systems. "The Series A is nearly closed," one VC mentioned, swirling his bourbon. "We're leading with 15 million, but there's room for another 5 from the right partner. This was exactly the kind of opportunity I needed: early access to potentially transformative technology outside Richard's usual investment sectors. I joined their conversation casually, asking informed questions about the technical approach. My background gave me credibility they weren't expecting from Richard Harrington's wife. By midnight, I had secured an introduction to the founder and an invitation to review their technical documentation. The next morning, while Richard nursed a hangover, I slipped away to my private study and examined the materials using my secure laptop. The technology was genuinely revolutionary, a new approach to quantum error correction that could increase coherence times by orders of magnitude. I moved quickly, using the encrypted communication channel Thomas had established. I instructed him to transfer $1.8 million to a newly created investment vehicle, Parallax Ventures LLC, another entity in my growing network of shells. From there, I reached out directly to the Nexus Quantum founder, Dr. Elena Zhang. "I represent a private investment group interested in your Series A," I wrote, using an email identity completely separate from my personal or family accounts. "We're prepared to commit $5 million, but require certain conditions. My key stipulation: a portion of my investment would convert to preferred shares with specific liquidation preferences. More importantly, I negotiated a clause allowing early distribution of proceeds to minority investors under certain triggering events, an unusual provision that raised eyebrows, but was ultimately accepted due to the competitive funding environment. This single investment became the cornerstone of my financial separation strategy. Within 14 months, Nexus Quantum's breakthrough attracted acquisition interest from major tech companies. When the bidding war ended, my $5 million investment, leveraged through a structure Elizabeth had designed, returned nearly $62 million. The beauty of this counter move lay in its complete invisibility to Richard. While he focused on traditional investment classes, real estate, established tech companies, commodities, I concentrated on emerging technologies with exponential growth potential. More importantly, I ensured these investments remained outside the financial ecosystem. He monitored different banks, different investment vehicles, different legal jurisdictions, a parallel financial universe he couldn't see and wouldn't think to look for. The Nexus Quantum windfall provided the capital base I needed for rapid expansion. Working with Margaret, I developed an investment thesis focusing on three specific technology sectors: advanced cryptography, synthetic biology, and next-generation energy storage. "These fields share key characteristics," Margaret noted during one of our secure meetings. "They're technically complex, making them difficult for non-specialists to evaluate properly. They're early stage, with massively asymmetric risk-reward profiles. And most importantly, they're outside Richard's expertise and interest. With each successful investment, I channeled profits through increasingly sophisticated structures. Cayman entities fed Luxembourg holding companies, which invested through Singapore funds, which ultimately connected back to my core assets through a labyrinth of legal arrangements so complex that even the lawyers who helped create them couldn't map the entire system." Elizabeth called it financial steganography, hiding assets not through concealment, but through complexity. "Even if someone suspects something exists," she explained, "they won't be able to find it without already knowing exactly where to look." 18 months after my initial moves, my separate fortune had grown to just over $320 million, still modest compared to our family's visible wealth, but entirely mine and completely invisible to Richard. During this period, I maintained my role as the perfect wife impeccably. I attended the right events, charmed the right people, maintained our homes with exacting standards. I gave Richard no reason to suspect anything had changed. When he mentioned investments or financial matters, I displayed the carefully calibrated interest he expected, informed enough to appear engaged, but never threatening his perception of superior expertise. "The Tokyo real estate play netted us 14%, he mentioned one evening over dinner, clearly expecting admiration. "That's wonderful," I replied with precisely the right amount of supportive enthusiasm, never revealing that one of my synthetic biology investments had returned over 3,000% in the same period. My first counter move was complete. I had established independent financial resources substantial enough to support the next phases of my strategy. More importantly, I had proven to myself that I could operate undetected building power and leverage while maintaining a perfect facade. What Richard saw as submission was actually calculation. What he interpreted as acceptance was strategic patience, and what he would eventually recognize as defeat was already in motion, one careful move at a time. With my financial infrastructure established and growing, I turned my attention to securing other vital assets: physical, legal, and informational protections that would become essential when Richard eventually made his move. The first was real estate. While Richard focused on trophy properties, mansions, and recognizable zip codes, Penthouses in famous buildings, vacation homes in prestigious resorts, I quietly acquired properties through my network of entities, prioritizing security and anonymity over status. The Boston penthouse where I now stood was purchased through Horizon Acquisition Trust, a vehicle 6 layers removed from any connection to me. The building itself was unremarkable from the outside, a renovated pre-war structure in Bay Village with excellent security but deliberately low profile. Similar properties followed a modernist house on a remote stretch of the Oregon coastline, a converted lighthouse on a private island in Maine, a mountain retreat accessible only by helicopter in northern New Mexico. Each was purchased with cash, held by different entities, staffed by personnel who had never met me in person, and maintained in constant readiness. Physical security is as important as financial security, Elizabeth had advised. You need places to go that he can't find, can't reach, and ideally doesn't know exist. The second protective measure was documentation. Working with Harold, I created a comprehensive archive of our married life financial records, email communications, phone logs, travel itineraries, photographs, everything meticulously organized and authenticated. In high net worth divorces, information asymmetry determines outcomes. Harold explained during one of our secure meetings in his Brooklyn office. The partner with better documentation nearly always prevails. He helped me establish legal structures that would protect my interests when the inevitable confrontation came multiple trusts with carefully crafted provisions. Intellectual property assignments for technologies I had helped develop but received no credit for. And most importantly, evidence of Richard's systematic concealment of assets. We're not just building a defense, Harold said, reviewing the growing legal architecture. We're creating a position so strong that he'll realize pursuing you is against his own interests. But perhaps the most crucial secondary protection involved technology. Daniel implemented what he called digital compartmentalization, a comprehensive system ensuring my activities remained invisible to Richard's surveillance. Your husband has sophisticated monitoring in place, Daniel explained, showing me evidence of spyware on my official devices and throughout our shared homes. He's tracking your calls, emails, movements, and financial activities. The solution was elegant. I would allow these systems to continue monitoring a carefully curated version of my life. While my real activities took place on entirely separate infrastructure, Daniel established a private communication network using hardened devices, rotating encryption keys, and physical security measures that would impress intelligence agencies. Every message, file transfer, and digital meeting occurred within this secure ecosystem, completely isolated from conventional monitoring. Think of it as a digital diversion, he said. We're giving his surveillance exactly what it expects to see, while the real you operates in a parallel dimension he can't access. This technological protection extended to my physical movements as well. When I needed to visit my separate properties or meet with my team, I developed a system of deliberate misdirection. A spa appointment would be booked and attended, but I would leave through a staff exit while a paid body double remained, creating digital evidence of my continued presence. Private flights were registered to shell companies with no connection to me. Travel documents used identities established through legal but obscure means. I even employed physical disguises when necessary changes, subtle enough to avoid attention, but sufficient to defeat facial recognition and casual observation, different hair, different posture, different styles, small alterations that accumulated into effective anonymity. All these protective measures converged into a comprehensive security system, financial, physical, legal, and digital layers working in concert to ensure that when Richard finally moved against me, I would be prepared from every angle. Throughout this preparation phase, I maintained my outward role impeccably. I hosted our seasonal galas, attended charity boards, accompanied Richard to business functions, the perfect corporate wife, seemingly content with her diminished role. If he noticed my occasional absences, they were always explainable shopping trips, spa weekends, visits to a fictitious friend suffering through chemo. I fed his surveillance systems exactly the data they expected, never deviating enough to trigger suspicion. 3 years into my counter strategy, an unexpected development accelerated my timeline. While using one of my secure access points into our home network, I discovered a series of consultations Richard had initiated with high profile divorce attorneys known for representing men in contentious high net worth separations. He was preparing his exit, just as I had suspected. The discovery should have been alarming, but instead, I felt an almost serene confirmation. The game I had been preparing for was finally approaching its active phase. That evening, as we dressed for yet another corporate dinner, I watched Richard adjust his tie in the mirror, so confident, so utterly unaware that his carefully planned escape strategy was about to collide with my far more thorough preparation. You look thoughtful tonight, he commented. noticing my reflection behind him. I smiled with practiced warmth. Just appreciating the view, I replied, allowing him to assume I meant his reflection. What I was actually appreciating was the knowledge that my secondary protective measures were complete. My parallel life financially independent, physically secure, legally fortified, and digitally invisible was fully operational. When Richard finally made his move, he would discover that the woman he thought he was leaving with nothing had already built something he couldn't touch, couldn't find, and couldn't begin to comprehend. The first hint that my preparation would pay off came unexpectedly during a charity gala at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. Richard and I were seated at different tables, a strategic choice he had made to place himself next to the wife of a potential investor. During the second course, Benjamin, my private investigator, sent a coded text, urgent, check secure channel. I excused myself to the ladies' room, locking myself in a stall to check my secure phone. The message contained a series of photographs taken barely an hour earlier at the Mandarin Oriental, Richard and Victoria entering a suite, documentation of a meeting with his divorce attorney earlier that day, a calendar entry showing the divorce filing scheduled for Tuesday morning, less than 48 hours away. So, the moment had finally arrived. I took a deep breath, feeling an odd sense of relief. 3 years of preparation were about to be tested. I sent a single-word response to Margaret's secure line, initiated. When I returned to the gala, I played my role perfectly, smiling, bidding generously during the auction, dancing with Richard when expected, looking at us. No one would have guessed that I had just activated the most elaborate counter strategy in the history of high net worth divorces, or that by the time Richard realized what was happening, it would already be too late. The divorce proceedings began exactly as I had anticipated. Richard's lawyer, James Hoffman, a notorious shark known for aggressive tactics, filed the petition on Tuesday morning with specific timing designed to catch me unprepared. The papers were served while I was supposedly alone at our Newton home, delivered by a process server who took obvious satisfaction in his role. I accepted the documents with a carefully calibrated display of shock and confusion. The server, no doubt instructed to report back on my reaction, would have described a woman caught completely off guard, struggling to maintain composure as her world collapsed. It was, of course, a performance. I had known the filing was coming for days. Thanks to Daniel's ongoing surveillance of Richard's communications, I had reviewed a draft of the petition before it was even finalized, courtesy of a source Harold had cultivated within Hoffman's firm. The terms were breathtakingly vindictive. Richard claimed I had contributed negligible value to our marital estate. He sought to retain all major assets, properties, investments, art, vehicles offering only a modest monthly stipend that would expire after 5 years. The document painted me as an ornamental wife whose comfortable lifestyle had been entirely dependent on his financial genius, according to the carefully constructed timeline I had pieced together. Richard expected me to panic. To call friends who would be unavailable, he had already started a whisper campaign about my increasing instability. To seek emergency legal representation and be forced to accept whoever was available on short notice instead. I waited precisely 4 hours before contacting Harold, who officially became my attorney of record by that afternoon. His initial response to Hoffman was a masterpiece of measured restraint, neither aggressive enough to suggest preparedness, nor weak enough to indicate surrender. Richard's first attempt to regain control came the following day. All credit cards in my name were suddenly declined. Access to our joint accounts was restricted. The household staff at our primary residence were terminated without notice, and security codes changed. These financial pressure tactics were supposed to leave me desperate, willing to accept unfavorable terms to regain access to basic resources. Had I been the unprepared spouse he imagined, they might have worked. Instead, I simply activated the parallel financial infrastructure I had built. My independent credit cards, accounts, and resources functioned perfectly. When the statement from my apparently frozen primary credit card arrived days later, I noted with amusement that my last purchase had been a modest lunch at a cafe near our home, hardly the desperate spending spree of someone anticipating being cut off. Richard's second move came a week later when he orchestrated what was meant to be a devastating personal betrayal. 3 of my closest friends from our social circle reached out within hours of each other, inviting me to lunch or coffee to talk about what's happening. Daniel had intercepted their earlier communications with Richard. Each had agreed to meet with me and report back on my emotional state, financial concerns, and any revelations about legal strategy. In exchange, they received promises of continued social access to Richard and his influential circle. I accepted all 3 invitations, using each meeting to feed carefully crafted misinformation. To one, I expressed confusion about basic financial matters. To another, I confided fears about affording proper legal representation. To the third, I revealed apparent anxiety about finding somewhere to live. All of this, I knew, would be relayed directly to Richard, reinforcing his belief that I was floundering exactly as he had planned. His third attempt at control was more direct. 10 days after filing, he requested an amicable conversation to discuss terms at a restaurant of his choosing. The location, a private dining room at an exclusive club where he was a member, but I was only permitted as his guest was another calculated power play. I arrived 15 minutes late, a deliberate choice that I knew would irritate his obsessive punctuality. He sat at the head of a small table, a manila folder placed precisely before him, his expression a practiced blend of regret and resolution. Jennifer, he began, using the conciliatory tone he reserved for business opponents he intended to crush. This doesn't need to be adversarial. I think we can reach arrangements that work for both of us. I sat down, arranging my features into an expression of wounded dignity with just a hint of fear. I'm still trying to understand why. Richard, after 15 years, I deserve that much. He launched into a clearly rehearsed speech about growing apart and different priorities, never once mentioning Victoria or the true financial motivations behind his decision. As he spoke, I nodded at appropriate intervals, appearing to hang on every word while actually observing his tells, the slight tightening around his eyes when lying, the unconscious adjustment of his watch when discussing money. Finally, he opened the folder and slid a document across to me. I'm prepared to be generous, despite what my lawyers advise. This offer gives you the Cape Cod house and a settlement that will keep you comfortable. I glanced at the document without touching it. The generous offer represented less than 1% of our actual marital assets, though, of course, significantly more than the initial filing had proposed. This was the classic anchoring technique: start with an outrageous position to make a merely unfair one seem reasonable by comparison. I'll need time to review this with my attorney, I said softly. His expression hardened slightly. Jennifer, involving aggressive lawyers will only deplete the estate. Everyone loses except the attorneys. This is a fair offer considering your contributions to our marriage. The condescension in his voice was palpable. This was the real Richard, the one he had increasingly allowed me to see in private as his plans progressed. I reached for the document, my fingers trembling slightly, another calculated display of weakness. I just need some time to process everything. He nodded, satisfied, in his mind. I was behaving exactly as expected, overwhelmed, uncertain, and fundamentally outmatched as I left the restaurant. I texted Benjamin a single word: proceeding. Phase 2 of my counter strategy was now active. Richard's initial attempts to control the divorce narrative had failed. Though he didn't yet realize it, each move he made, thinking he was cornering me, only positioned him more precisely within my own design. His confidence, his certainty of victory, was exactly what I needed him to maintain for just a little while longer. 3 weeks into the divorce proceedings, I made my first offensive move. Until this point, I had been entirely reactive in Richard's eyes, responding to his filings, his financial restrictions, his settlement offers. This carefully maintained appearance of defensive posturing had lulled him into dangerous overconfidence. The first confrontation began with a seemingly innocuous legal filing by Harold, a standard request for financial disclosure. Something expected in any divorce, the document itself appeared routine, listing categories of assets that should be declared: real estate, investment accounts, business interests, artwork, vehicles. What made this filing different was a seemingly minor addendum on page 17, a specific request for information regarding any and all financial interests in the Cayman Islands, particularly those associated with Harrington Global Partners or related entities. Harrington Global Partners was Richard's secret offshore structure, the one I had discovered 3 years earlier, the catalyst for my own counter strategy. Its existence was known only to Richard, his private banker, and the attorney who had established it, or so he believed. I wasn't in the room when Richard received notification of the filing, but Benjamin's surveillance captured his reaction: the sudden stillness, the rereading of the specific paragraph, the immediate call to his attorney with explicit instructions to step outside his office to take the call. Even through the surveillance footage, without audio, the tension in his body language was unmistakable. Within 40 minutes, I received the call I had been anticipating. My phone displayed Richard's name, the first direct contact he had initiated since serving the divorce papers. I let it ring 4 times before answering, my voice carefully calibrated to sound distracted. "Hello, we need to talk." His tone was controlled but tight. "Not over the phone, in person." I paused as if considering this request. "I'm not sure that's a good idea. Richard, Harold advised that all communications should, this afternoon, the house, 4 o'clock. He cut me off sharply. Come alone, if you bring your lawyer. This conversation becomes very different. The threat was implicit but clear. 4 o'clock, I agreed, and he hung up. I smiled at the blank phone screen. His urgency confirmed what I already knew. The mention of Harrington Global had struck precisely the nerve I'd intended. Now came the delicate part of the confrontation, the careful balance between revealing enough knowledge to unsettle him while concealing the true extent of my preparation. At exactly 4:15 p.m., late enough to signal independence, but not so late as to provoke real anger, I arrived at what had been our primary Newton residence. The housekeeper, clearly briefed on the situation, escorted me to the library with uncomfortable deference, no longer certain of my status in the household Richard now controlled. Richard waited in the library, standing by the windows overlooking the gardens. He didn't turn when I entered a small power play intended to make me approach him, to place me in the position of supplicant. Instead, I took a seat on the leather sofa and waited in silence. After nearly a minute, he finally turned. How did you know about Harrington Global? No greeting, no preamble, the question that had clearly been consuming him since the filing. I maintained an expression of mild confusion. I'm not sure what you mean. Harold prepared the disclosure requests. Standard procedure. From what I understand. His eyes narrowed, searching my face for deception. That specific entity, that specific jurisdiction that's not standard procedure. I shrugged slightly. I believe his team reviews financial patterns, looking for common structures used in high net worth divorces. Maybe something in our regular account suggested offshore holdings. I offered this plausible explanation with just enough uncertainty to sound genuine. He moved to the bar, pouring himself 3 fingers of the rare Japanese whiskey he reserved for significant moments. His hand was steady, but the amount he poured betrayed his agitation. Let's be direct, he said, turning back to me. What exactly do you think you know? I allowed a small, sad smile. I know enough. Richard, meaning I know about the accounts. I know about the transfers. I know about the assets that somehow never appeared on our family balance sheets. I kept my statements deliberately vague, letting him fill in the specifics with his own guilty knowledge. He took a long sip of whiskey, his eyes never leaving mine. You've misunderstood some routine business structures. My team will clarify everything for the court. Will they? I asked softly. Will they explain the quarterly transfers to Grand Cayman, the shell company in Bermuda, the property purchases through nominees in Monaco? With each question, I watched his expression tighten incrementally. I had never specified amounts, dates, or exact mechanisms, just enough accurate details to suggest comprehensive knowledge while revealing nothing about my sources or the extent of my information. He set his glass down carefully. What do you want, Jennifer? And there it was, the pivot from denial to negotiation, the first significant shift in our power dynamic. I want what's fair, I replied simply. He laughed a short, harsh sound. Fair, you've been the beneficiary of my work, my connections, my financial acumen for 15 years. The lifestyle you've grown accustomed to exists because of me. Is that what you tell yourself? I kept my tone gentle, almost sympathetic. That I contributed nothing, that I was merely decorative. I'm not saying you contributed nothing. He backtracked slightly, shifting to a more conciliatory approach. But let's be realistic about the value equation here. I stood up, smoothing my skirt with deliberate calm. I think we have different definitions of value. Richard. Always have. I moved toward the door, then paused and turned back. Oh, and Harold suggested I mention that any attempts to move or liquidate contested assets during divorce proceedings could be problematic, particularly assets that weren't properly disclosed initially. The color drained from his face slightly. Is that a threat? Not at all, I replied evenly. Just sharing relevant legal information. Isn't that what these conversations are for open communication? As I left, I felt his eyes boring into my back, his mind undoubtedly racing through scenarios, calculating risks, reevaluating his position. For the first time, uncertainty had entered his equation. In the elevator, I texted Harold a single word: initiated. Within hours, his team would file additional requests targeting 3 more of Richard's secret structure's entities I had known about for years but strategically held back from the initial filing. Each new revelation would increase his anxiety, forcing him to wonder what else I knew, how I knew it, and most importantly, what I planned to do with the information. The first direct confrontation had achieved exactly what I intended: destabilization. Richard now faced an adversary he hadn't anticipated, not the helpless, uninformed wife he had expected, but someone with knowledge he couldn't account for and composure he couldn't rattle. The balance of power had shifted subtly but unmistakably, and he was only beginning to realize it. After leaving Richard in our former home, I didn't immediately return to my hidden penthouse. Instead, I instructed my driver to take me to the public garden. Despite the chill in the air, I needed to walk, to process what had just transpired and what it represented. As I followed the winding paths around the lagoon, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the water, I found myself in a curious emotional state, not exactly triumph, not exactly vindication, but something more nuanced, a crystalline clarity about who I had been, who I had become, and the distance between those two versions of myself. 3 years ago, when I first discovered Richard's betrayal, my initial reaction had been pain so acute it felt physical, a hollowing sensation beneath my ribs, as if something vital had been extracted. I had loved him, or at least the carefully constructed version of him he had allowed me to see. I had built my life around our partnership, compromised my ambitions for what I thought was our shared future. The woman I had been then would have confronted him immediately. Tears, accusations, demands for explanations. She would have sought reconciliation, or at least emotional closure. She would have needed him to acknowledge the depth of his betrayal, to witness the pain he had caused. But that confrontation would have given him exactly what he wanted: emotional leverage, confirmation of his power to affect me, the satisfaction of seeing me diminished by his actions. Instead, I had chosen a different path, not out of vindictiveness, though I won't pretend that element was entirely absent, but out of a deeper recognition the rules of the game we were playing had always been different than I'd understood. While I had been investing in a partnership, Richard had been executing a long-term transaction. My value to him had always been calculated in terms of enhancement to his image, access to my connections, the prestige of an accomplished wife who nonetheless remained in his shadow. The revelation wasn't just about his financial deception or even his infidelity. It was about recognizing that the entire foundation of our relationship had been built on fundamentally misaligned values. I stopped at a bench overlooking the water, watching joggers circle the lagoon in their relentless loops. My phone buzzed with a message from Daniel. Target accessed Attorney Portal 3X since meeting, making urgent calls, surveillance continuing. Richard was rattled, exactly as intended. But my satisfaction came not from his discomfort, but from my own evolution. The woman who had walked out of that library today was not the same one who had discovered his betrayal 3 years ago. The differences went beyond strategy, beyond the careful preparations and countermoves. I had reclaimed something essential that had been slowly, almost imperceptibly eroded during our marriage: my sense of self-determination, my absolute clarity about my own worth, not as it related to him or to any external validation, but as an intrinsic truth. My phone buzzed again. Margaret this time. Markets closing, all positions secure, contingencies in place. The technical details of my financial strategy were complex, but the underlying principle was simple independence, not just from Richard specifically, but from the need for any external validation of my value. The wealth I had built wasn't just about money, though $5.1 billion certainly provided extraordinary freedom. It was about creating a foundation that was entirely mine, reflecting my judgments, my risk tolerance, my vision. The sun dipped lower, casting golden light across the park. I continued walking, my pace measured, unhurried. Another message appeared, herald confirming that the additional filings had been submitted, precisely timed for maximum legal impact. Each of these messages represented a strand in the web I had patiently constructed over 3 years: financial, legal, informational, strategic layers of preparation that had transformed what could have been a devastating loss into a position of unexpected strength. But there was another transformation, one less visible but more fundamental. The pain that had initially driven me, the hurt of betrayal, the shock of discovering Richard's true nature, had evolved into something clearer and colder: not hatred, which would still represent an emotional investment in him, but a profound indifference. I no longer needed him to recognize what he had lost in me, to regret his choices, to suffer for his arrogance. His journey was his own, distinct from my path forward. This was perhaps the most unexpected gift of his betrayal: complete emotional freedom, the realization that his opinion of me, his assessment of my worth, his very existence in my world, none of it was necessary to my happiness or success. As I completed my circuit of the lagoon, the lights of the city beginning to glimmer in the gathering dusk, I felt a sense of alignment that had been absent for too long. My external actions and my internal reality were finally congruent. No more performance, no more compromise, no more strategic diminishment of my capabilities to accommodate someone else's ego. The divorce was still unfolding, the legal complexities still in motion, but in the most essential way. I had already moved beyond it, beyond him. I texted my driver to pick me up at the Commonwealth Avenue entrance. As I waited, a final message appeared, this one from Elizabeth. Preparing for acceleration. All systems ready. The next phase would move more quickly, with less room for Richard to maneuver, less opportunity for him to recover his balance. Where the past 3 years had been about patient preparation, the coming weeks would be about precise execution. The black SUV pulled up, my driver stepping out to open the door with professional discretion. As I settled into the leather seat, I found myself thinking not about Richard's reaction to today's revelations, but about the projects I wanted to pursue once this chapter was definitively closed. Technologies that could address climate adaptation challenges, medical research that had been underfunded due to market failures rather than scientific obstacles, educational innovations for communities systematically excluded from opportunity. For too long, my ambitions had been contained within the narrow parameters of what complemented rather than challenged Richard's self-image. Now, with billions at my disposal and complete independence of action, I could pursue impact at a scale I had only imagined before. The SUV moved smoothly through evening traffic, the city transforming around us as we passed from the old money quietude of Beacon Hill to the vibrant energy of downtown. I watched the changing neighborhoods through tinted windows, feeling a quiet certainty settle over me. Whatever happened next in the chess match with Richard, whatever desperate countermoves he might attempt, as he realized the true extent of his miscalculation, I had already achieved the most important victory. I had reclaimed myself. Everything else was just details. Cody's divorce proceedings began accelerating as my strategic revelations continued to destabilize his position. Each new legal filing from Harold exposed another layer of Richard's hidden financial architecture, creating a cascade effect that rippled through his professional and personal life. 2 days after our confrontation in the library, Benjamin's surveillance reported Richard's first major setback. His private banker in Zurich had frozen access to several key accounts pending routine compliance verification, a process triggered by algorithms Elizabeth had designed months earlier. This wasn't illegal interference, simply strategic application of the same financial compliance systems banks used to flag suspicious activity. In Richard's case, specific transaction patterns had been subtly highlighted for review, creating bureaucratic obstacles that would take weeks to resolve. By the following morning, the professional consequences accelerated. The managing partner at Meridian Capital Partners, Richard's investment firm, requested an immediate meeting with their legal team present. Though I wasn't privy to the conversation itself, the outcome became clear when Richard's executive biography disappeared from the firm's website 3 hours later. A press release followed. Meridian Capital Partners announces organizational changes effective immediately. The careful corporate language masked the reality of what had occurred. Richard had been placed on administrative leave pending review of certain investment structures, a professional purgatory from which few ever returned. The social consequences unfolded in parallel. Invitations were rescinded. Standing reservations at exclusive restaurants became mysteriously unavailable. The subtle machinery of high society exclusion operated with ruthless efficiency once the signal had been given that Richard's status had changed. Most telling was the sudden absence of calls and messages from people who had once sought his favor. Daniel's monitoring showed the precipitous decline in communication, a digital representation of social abandonment happening in real time. The personal consequences were perhaps the most predictable, but no less devastating. 48 hours after our meeting, Victoria's assistant collected her personal items from Richard's Boston penthouse while he was in meetings with his legal team. By evening, she had boarded a flight to Chicago 2 weeks earlier than her new position ostensibly required. She left without a personal goodbye, sending only a brief text. "This isn't what I signed up for. Good luck with everything." The message's timestamp showed it was sent when her flight was already airborne, a digital farewell designed to prevent response or persuasion. Within 3 days, Richard had lost his professional standing, social position, and personal relationship, the three pillars that had supported his identity and self-conception. What made these consequences so devastating wasn't just their substance, but their apparent inevitability. None could be directly attributed to vindictive action on my part. Each appeared to be the natural result of his own choices, his own behaviors, his own vulnerabilities exposed to natural scrutiny. The settlement papers arrived at his attorney's office as promised. The terms were, by objective standards, reasonable, a clean 50-50 division of our documented marital assets, no punitive claims, no excessive demands. What the documents didn't mention, of course, was the parallel fortune I had built, the billions that existed beyond the boundaries of our marital estate, secured through structures he couldn't access or even fully comprehend. The most remarkable aspect of the aftermath was Richard's isolation. In constructing his life around transactions rather than relationships, he had created no genuine support system. Those who had surrounded him, colleagues, social connections, even Victoria, had been attracted to his success, his status, his utility to their own ambitions. When those external markers of value diminished, so did their interest in him as a person. The transactional worldview that had guided his approach to our marriage ultimately defined all his relationships, and when he could no longer offer favorable terms, those relationships revealed their conditional nature. 5 days after our confrontation, Richard's attorney contacted Harold, requesting an in-person meeting to discuss potential adjustments to the proposed settlement. The language was professional, but the subtext was clear capitulation. Richard had finally recognized what I had known for 3 years, that true power lies not in controlling others, but in creating systems that operate independently of direct control, generating consequences that appear both natural and inevitable. The finalization of the divorce occurred with remarkable efficiency once Richard accepted the inevitable. What might have been years of contentious litigation concluded in less than 6 weeks. The settlement agreement was signed without fanfare, a simple DocuSign notification appearing on my phone one Tuesday afternoon while I was reviewing investment proposals in my Bay Village penthouse. That digital signature marked the formal end of our 15-year marriage, but my personal transformation had been completed long before the legal dissolution. The woman who signed those documents bore little resemblance to the one who had discovered Richard's betrayal 3 years earlier. The most profound change wasn't financial, though $5.1 billion certainly provided extraordinary freedom. It wasn't social, though I had reconstructed my circle with people chosen for authenticity rather than utility. It wasn't even professional, though. I had reclaimed my identity as a strategic thinker and technological innovator. The fundamental transformation was internal, a complete recalibration of how I understood value, power, and my own identity. For too long, I had accepted Richard's framing of our world's success measured by acquisition, value determined by external validation, power expressed through control over others, and gradually extracting myself from that framework, I had discovered an entirely different paradigm. True wealth wasn't about accumulation, but about agency, the capacity to pursue what mattered without constraint. The billions I had built were significant, not for their numerical value, but for the latitude they provided to invest in transformative technologies, support overlooked causes, explore ideas without concern for immediate return. True connection wasn't transactional, but relational, built on mutual recognition rather than mutual utility. During my years of preparation, I had reconstructed my inner circle with extraordinary care. Margaret remained my closest advisor, her sharp mind undimmed by age. Harold, Daniel, Elizabeth, and Benjamin had begun as hired specialists, but evolved into trusted partners, each bringing unique perspective to challenges we now tackled together. Most significantly, I had reconnected with individuals from my pre-Richard life, former colleagues, mentors, friends whose relationships had been based on genuine affinity rather than strategic advantage. These reconnections helped me rediscover aspects of myself that had been submerged during my marriage: my irreverent humor, my passion for obscure technological problems, my appreciation for unconventional thinking. True power, I had learned, wasn't about dominance, but about discernment, the ability to perceive reality accurately and respond appropriately. The strength of my position against Richard hadn't come from resources or tactics alone, but from seeing clearly the patterns he couldn't recognize, understanding dynamics he couldn't perceive. This clarity now extended to all areas of my life. I evaluated opportunities not by status or appearance, but by substance and impact. I judged character not by polish or pedigree, but by consistency and integrity. I measured success not by comparison to others, but by alignment with my own values. The morning after the divorce was finalized, I woke early and walked to the rooftop terrace of my penthouse. The city was just beginning to stir, the first light illuminating the skyline with a clarity that seemed significant. I had always been an early riser, but during my marriage, I had adapted to Richard's preference for late mornings. This simple reclamation of my natural rhythm symbolized the broader recalibration. I had already initiated several new ventures: a quantum computing initiative focused on climate modeling, a medical research foundation targeting neglected diseases, an educational technology platform designed to democratize advanced learning. Each reflected priorities that had been important to me before my identity became subsumed in Richard's narrative. These weren't chosen as repudiations of my past, but as affirmations of my authentic interests, the first expressions of a voice that had been temporarily muted, but never truly silenced. The legal end of my marriage didn't feel like conclusion, but like commencement, the formal beginning of a life I had already been constructing. The document simply acknowledged what had already occurred, my complete emancipation from a relationship that had evolved from partnership to containment. Standing on that rooftop, watching the city awaken, I experienced what can only be described as radical freedom, not just from Richard specifically, but from external definitions of success, from prescribed paths, from the subtle constraints I had internalized over years of gradual compromise. The woman who had once calculated her words to avoid threatening a fragile male ego now spoke with unfiltered clarity. The professional who had stepped back from operational roles to support her husband's career now launched ambitious ventures based on her own vision. The social figure who had hosted events designed to enhance her husband's status now created gatherings centered on ideas rather than influence. The transformation was complete not because I had won against Richard, though that victory was undeniable, but because I had recognized and dismantled the internal structures that had made his influence possible in the first place. I had not just secured my freedom from a specific relationship. I had liberated myself from an entire framework of valuation that had never truly served me. 3 months after the divorce was finalized, I received an unexpected message from an encrypted email address I didn't recognize. The subject line read simply, "Regarding RH, important." The body contained nothing but a date, time, and the name of an obscure cafe in the South End. My first instinct was to disregard it. The divorce was settled, my new life well underway. But something about the clinical precision of the message suggested it wasn't random. After having Daniel verify the message contained no malicious code or tracking elements, I decided to attend, taking appropriate security precautions. I arrived 15 minutes early, positioning myself at a corner table with clear sight lines to both the entrance and rear exit. Benjamin's team had secured the surrounding area, with 2 operatives discreetly seated at nearby tables. At precisely the appointed time, a woman entered the cafe mid-60s, impeccably dressed in understated luxury, carrying herself with the confident ease of someone accustomed to power. I didn't recognize her, but her assessment of the room was too systematic to be casual. Her gaze settled on me with quiet recognition. Though we had never met, she approached without hesitation. "Ms. Morgan, I'm Catherine Harrington." The surname registered immediately. Harrington, Richard's mother. I gestured to the seat across from me, maintaining a neutral expression despite my surprise. Catherine Harrington was a near-mythic figure in Richard's narrative, the brilliant economist who had raised him alone after his father abandoned them, who had sacrificed everything for his education, who had instilled in him the drive that defined his career. In 15 years of marriage, I had never met her. Richard had always claimed she was reclusive, preferring her research position at a university in Switzerland to social engagement. Our communication had been limited to perfunctory birthday cards and occasional brief phone calls on holidays. "Thank you for coming," she said, declining the offer of coffee from the approaching server. "I'll be direct. I've been monitoring the situation between you and my son for some time." The implication was clear and startling. She had been aware of our conflict, perhaps even its underlying causes, long before it became public. "I should clarify," she continued, noting my expression, "that Richard and I have not been close for many years, despite the narrative he's constructed. My interest in your situation is professional, as well as personal." She reached into her bag and placed a small leather portfolio on the table. "I believe these might provide context for some questions you may still have." Inside were documents that immediately shifted my understanding of everything that had transpired: financial records, correspondence, and most significantly, strategic plans dating back to before I had even met Richard. "He was recruited directly out of business school," Catherine explained, her tone clinically detached despite discussing her son. "Meridian identified him as having the precise psychological profile they sought: ambitious but insecure, intelligent but not original, driven but ultimately controllable." The documents revealed an astonishing truth: Richard had never been the strategic mastermind behind his success. He had been an exceptionally effective frontman for interests that operated at a level of financial sophistication far beyond his comprehension. His career, his investments, even aspects of his personal life had been guided by handlers he never recognized as such. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked, processing the implications. "Because you did something unexpected," she replied. "You not only outmaneuvered Richard, which isn't particularly difficult for someone of your capabilities, but you constructed a parallel financial architecture that even Meridian's surveillance couldn't penetrate. That caught certain people's attention." The conversation that followed revealed dimensions to my own story I hadn't realized existed. Catherine wasn't just Richard's estranged mother. She was a senior strategist for a network of family offices controlling generational wealth, measured in hundreds of billions, a group she called the Legacy Circle. "We've been watching how you deploy capital through those quantum structures Elizabeth designed for you," she said, referencing my financial architect by name with unsettling familiarity, particularly your positions in synthetic biology and quantum encryption. They suggest a strategic vision that aligns with certain long horizon initiatives. By the conversation's end, the revelation was clear. My victory over Richard hadn't just been personal. It had been an unexpected audition of sorts. My 3-year counter strategy had demonstrated capabilities that had brought me to the attention of networks operating in financial dimensions I hadn't known existed. Catherine left me with a simple encrypted drive and a proposition to consider not employment, not partnership, but something more ambiguous: access to information architectures and capital deployment mechanisms that operated beyond conventional financial systems. As she departed, she paused. "You thought you were just freeing yourself from Richard. In reality, you were demonstrating capacities that transcend that limited context entirely." I sat alone in the cafe long after she'd gone, absorbing the realization that the game I thought I'd been playing had been nested within a larger game I hadn't even perceived. The revelation from Catherine Harrington lingered in my mind as I stood on the balcony of my Bay Village penthouse, watching the sunset cast long shadows across the city. The encrypted drive she had given me remained on my desk. Unopened, a threshold I wasn't yet certain I wanted to cross. My journey had begun with a singular purpose: to protect myself from Richard's betrayal, to ensure I wouldn't be left vulnerable when his inevitable exit came. That mission had been accomplished with a thoroughness even I hadn't fully anticipated. The divorce was finalized, my fortune secure, my future entirely my own. Yet Catherine's appearance had revealed an unsettling truth: the game never ends. It simply evolves into more complex iterations, with higher stakes and more sophisticated players. The very capabilities that had secured my freedom from Richard had also made me visible to forces operating on levels I was only beginning to comprehend. This recognition prompted a fundamental question: what does true victory actually mean? When I discovered Richard's betrayal 3 years ago, I defined victory in oppositional terms: ensuring he wouldn't win, wouldn't take what was mine, wouldn't leave me destitute. My strategy had been brilliant in its execution, comprehensive in its success, by any conventional measure. I had won completely. But standing here now, I recognized the limitation of victory defined by opposition. Outmaneuvering Richard, while satisfying and necessary, was ultimately a response to his actions rather than an expression of my own autonomous purpose. It had freed me from a specific constraint, but hadn't fully defined what that freedom was for. The more profound victory wasn't over Richard, but over the mindset he represented: the transactional view of relationships, the equation of worth with possession, the belief that power meant control over others rather than authorship of one's own experience. Catherine's unexpected appearance had inadvertently clarified something essential. I could continue playing ever more sophisticated versions of the same game, moving to higher levels with bigger stakes and more powerful players. Or I could choose a different game entirely, one defined by my own values rather than reactive positioning against others. The $5.1 billion I had accumulated provided extraordinary optionality. But true freedom didn't come from the amount itself, but from the clarity with which it was deployed. Finance had been the arena of my counter strategy against Richard because that was where the threat had manifested. But it needn't define the purpose toward which my reclaimed agency was directed. I turned away from the view and walked to my desk, my gaze falling on the encrypted drive. The networks Catherine represented offered access to financial dimensions beyond what I had already mastered: knowledge architectures and capital deployment mechanisms operating at global scale. After a moment's consideration, I placed the drive in a secure drawer rather than immediately accessing its contents, not as rejection, but as assertion of the principle that would guide my decisions moving forward: deliberate choice rather than reactive response. Whatever path I chose, whether engaging with Catherine's networks or pursuing entirely independent directions, would be determined by alignment with my own defined purpose rather than external validation or competitive positioning. The true lesson of my journey wasn't about wealth or revenge or even strategic brilliance. It was about the recognition that power, in its most authentic form, isn't measured by what you can take from others or do to others, but by your capacity to live from the center of your own values without distortion by either fear or obligation. Richard had approached life as a zero-sum game, where his victory required someone else's loss. The networks Catherine represented operated at higher levels of sophistication, but potentially within the same fundamental paradigm. The question facing me now was whether to advance within that paradigm or to step outside it entirely to play a different game with different metrics of success. I would make that decision not from reaction, but from intention, not from opposition, but from purpose, not from the past, but toward the future I chose to create. The city lights began to emerge as dusk deepened into evening. I felt a profound sense of completion regarding the chapter that had closed with the divorce, combined with genuine curiosity about the chapters yet to be written. The ultimate victory wasn't that I had defeated Richard, or reclaimed billions, or even discovered hidden networks of influence. It was that I now stood wholly in my own authority, free not just from a specific person, but from external definitions of value, from prescribed paths, from the subtle constraints of others' expectations. The woman who had once been defined in relation to Richard Harrington now existed entirely on her own terms, and that, in the end, was the only victory that truly mattered. I began the next phase of my life by fundamentally reimagining how wealth could be deployed. The first major initiative grew from a discovery by one of my synthetic biology investments, a breakthrough in nitrogen-fixing bacteria that could potentially transform agriculture in regions devastated by climate change. Instead of simply maximizing return on investment, I structured an innovative deployment model. The technology would be licensed at premium rates to large agribusiness in developed markets but made available at cost to small farmers in vulnerable regions. The model challenged conventional venture capital wisdom, but the numbers were compelling. The premium segment alone would generate substantial returns, while the at-cost distribution created resilience in global food systems and established relationships in emerging markets that would prove valuable over decades. Similar principles guided my approach to the quantum computing initiative. Rather than focusing exclusively on financial applications where the immediate profit potential was highest, we prioritized climate modeling and material science areas with longer horizons but greater collective impact. These weren't charitable endeavors disguised as investments. They were strategic bets on the proposition that long-term value creation requires addressing systemic challenges, not just extracting maximum short-term profit. It was a different vision of capitalism, one measured in decades and generations rather than quarters. 6 months after finalizing my divorce, I made my first public appearance as Jennifer Morgan, independent investor and technologist. The occasion was a TED Talk titled Quantum Finance Reimagining Value in Complex Systems. The presentation deliberately avoided any mention of my personal journey, focusing instead on the mathematical principles that had guided my investment strategy, the patterns that emerge in complex adaptive systems. The power of strategic patience, the asymmetric advantages available to those who recognize higher order effects. The talk went viral within financial circles, not because of any connection to Richard or our divorce, which remained largely private despite occasional tabloid speculation, but because it offered a genuinely novel framework for understanding market dynamics. Invitations flooded in speaking engagements, board positions, investment opportunities. I accepted a carefully curated few, primarily those that aligned with my emerging focus on resilience technologies and advanced education. Throughout this period, I maintained occasional contact with Catherine Harrington. Our relationship evolved into something between mentorship and alliance, not quite friendship, but a mutual recognition of complementary capabilities. I never fully engaged with the legacy circle, as she had initially proposed. Instead, I negotiated a more limited relationship access to certain information flows and occasional collaboration on specific initiatives, while maintaining my independence and distinct approach. You're making an interesting choice, Catherine observed during one of our infrequent meetings, this time at my main lighthouse property. Most people who glimpse what exists behind the conventional financial system either dive in completely or retreat entirely. I'm creating a third option, I replied, watching the Atlantic waves crash against the rocky shore below us. Selective engagement on my own terms. She studied me with that penetrating gaze that seemed to be evaluating multiple futures simultaneously. That's precisely why you're valuable. You see patterns others miss. You create options where others see only binaries. By the end of our first year post-divorce, my fortune had grown to nearly $8 billion. But the more significant evolution was in how that capital was structured and deployed, not as a static pool of assets, but as a dynamic system designed to identify and nurture transformative technologies while remaining fundamentally independent from traditional financial power centers. I had created what Margaret called a sovereign wealth fund of one, a financial entity with the scale and sophistication of a national investment authority, but the nimbleness and autonomy of an individual vision. The first major test of this new paradigm came unexpectedly, 18 months after my divorce. One of Richard's former associates reached out through Harold with an unusual proposition. Meridian Capital was imploding, the result of investigations triggered in part by the disclosures from our divorce proceedings. Their quantum computing portfolio, including several groundbreaking projects in quantum encryption, was being liquidated at distressed prices. The proposition was simple: acquire the entire portfolio at a fraction of its value. The opportunity was compelling purely on financial terms. These were technologies I understood intimately, with clear paths to commercialization. The projected return would be substantial even under conservative scenarios. But there was another dimension to consider. This acquisition would effectively complete the circle that began with Richard's betrayal. I would own the very technologies he had once dismissed as speculative nonsense when I proposed investing in them years earlier. It was tempting not just financially, but emotionally, a final punctuation mark on the narrative of our relationship. I spent a week analyzing the opportunity, not just through financial models, but through the lens of my evolving understanding of authentic power. Would this acquisition represent a strategic advance toward my defined objectives, or would it be a regression into the oppositional framing I had worked so hard to transcend? The answer came during a conversation with Margaret. We were walking along the Oregon coastline near my property there, the Pacific stretching endlessly before us. If Richard didn't exist, if your history with him wasn't a factor, would you make this investment? She asked, cutting through the complex analysis I had been sharing. I paused, considering the question in its simplest form. Yes, the technology aligns perfectly with our quantum resilience thesis. The valuation is compelling. The team is exceptional. Then make the decision on that basis, she said. The moment you factor him into the equation, either as someone to defeat or impress or prove something to, you've already lost something more valuable than money. She was right. Of course, true freedom meant making choices based on my own criteria, not in reference to the past or to someone who no longer held any legitimate claim on my attention. I acquired the quantum portfolio the following week, not as the final move in an old game, but as the first move in a new one. The press release made no mention of the Meridian connection, focusing instead on the integration of these technologies into my broader quantum initiative. If Richard noticed, he gave no public indication. Our paths never crossed again, though I occasionally heard updates through mutual acquaintances. He had relocated to Arizona, started a much smaller investment firm, remarried to someone decades his junior. The details held no emotional charge for me. They were simply information, relevant only to the extent that they confirmed the patterns I had long ago identified. On the third anniversary of my divorce, though, I noted the date only because my calendar system flagged it. I received an unexpected package. It contained a single item, a first edition copy of Anti-Fragile by Nassim Nicholas Taleb, with a brief note from Catherine Harrington. Some systems benefit from shocks. The note read, "You've built something remarkable from what was meant to destroy you. The next phase awaits." The book was inscribed with coordinates that, when entered into a secure browser, opened access to what Catherine had once described as the inner chambers of the Legacy Circle's information architecture, financial and technological insights far beyond what was available even to the most sophisticated conventional investors. This access represented a significant elevation, an acknowledgement that I had demonstrated not just the capability, but the discernment to operate at this level. I spent several days exploring this new information landscape, recognizing its extraordinary value while maintaining my characteristic caution about full integration into systems I didn't control. The insights were illuminating, particularly regarding emerging technologies at the intersection of quantum computing, synthetic biology, and advanced materials science. But perhaps more valuable was the meta-insight, seeing how Catherine's network evaluated and contextualized information, the patterns they prioritized, the horizons they monitored, rather than being absorbed into their framework. I integrated selected elements into my own evolving approach, creating a hybrid model that preserved my autonomy while benefiting from their broader perspective. This selective synthesis became the hallmark of what financial publications were beginning to call the Morgan Method, an investment philosophy that combined the pattern recognition of quantum mathematics with an unusual emphasis on resilience and optionality. As my public profile grew, I remained deliberately selective about appearances and interviews. I declined most requests for profiles focusing on the personal narrative of my divorce and emergence. Instead, I engaged primarily on topics related to my investment thesis and technological vision. The story the financial press created around me was largely speculation built on the few public facts available: successful biotech entrepreneur who had disappeared into marriage with a prominent fund manager, reemerged post-divorce with billions and a distinctive investment approach that was consistently outperforming traditional models. The truth, of course, was far more complex, a journey from calculated submission through strategic resistance to authentic self-definition. But that story remained private, known only to the small circle who had accompanied me through the transformation. 4 years after my divorce was finalized, I established the Morgan Institute for Resilient Systems, a research organization focused on technologies and methodologies that could help human communities adapt to accelerating change. The Institute brought together experts from diverse fields: quantum computing, synthetic biology, complex systems theory, behavioral economics, sustainable design, unified by a common focus on resilience as a defining characteristic of successful systems. The work quickly gained recognition not just for its intellectual rigor, but for its practical applications, technologies deployed in vulnerable communities around the world. Methodologies adopted by organizations ranging from small nonprofits to national governments. At the Institute's opening symposium, I gave a rare extended interview to a respected technology journalist. The conversation ranged widely across technical and philosophical terrain, but one exchange particularly resonated with the audience. You've created a remarkably distinctive approach to both technology investment and deployment, the journalist observed. What would you say is the core principle that guides your decisions? I considered the question carefully. I believe that true value emerges from alignment when our actions, our resources, and our deepest values operate as an integrated system rather than competing forces. Most conventional approaches treat these as separate domains, creating fundamental inefficiencies and contradictions. And how did you arrive at this philosophy? Was there a specific moment or insight that shaped your thinking? I smiled slightly, thinking of the long journey from that first discovery of Richard's betrayal to the present moment. Let's just say I learned through direct experience that misalignment between what we value and how we live, between what we build and what we believe, creates vulnerabilities that eventually undermine even the most carefully constructed facades. Some might call that cryptic, he pressed. I prefer to call it distilled, I replied. The specific details of our individual journeys matter less than the principles we extract from them. 5 years to the day after signing my divorce papers, I stood on the observation deck of my Oregon coastal home, watching a winter storm roll in from the Pacific. The massive glass walls, engineered to withstand hurricane-force winds, offered a panoramic view of nature's raw power waves crashing against the cliffs below, wind bending the ancient pines that surrounded the property. I had always been drawn to this particular home during moments of transition or reflection. Something about the elemental quality of this coastline, the collision of ocean and continent, the visible evidence of geological forces operating across vastly different timescales, provided useful perspective. My secure phone chimed with an incoming message, a quarterly update from Benjamin, who still maintained peripheral awareness of Richard's activities as a precautionary measure. Target has liquidated remaining U.S. holdings, relocated permanently to Dubai. Surveillance discontinued per protocol. With that simple message, the last thread connecting me to my former life was severed. Richard had moved beyond the horizon of relevance, becoming merely a data point in a pattern long since mapped and understood. I sent a brief acknowledgement, then deactivated that particular surveillance protocol. It had served its purpose and was no longer necessary. As the storm intensified, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment, from the shock of discovering Richard's betrayal through the methodical construction of my counter-strategy to the complete reinvention that followed. The woman who had once carefully modulated her intelligence to avoid threatening a fragile male ego now led one of the most innovative investment approaches in global finance. The wife who had been expected to serve as decorative support now directed technologies that were transforming how communities around the world adapted to crisis. The person who had been systematically diminished now operated with a scope and purpose entirely self-defined. But perhaps the most profound transformation wasn't external at all. It was the internal shift from reactive to generative, from making decisions in response to others' actions to creating from an authentic center of purpose. The storm reached its peak intensity, lightning illuminating the churning ocean in brief, brilliant flashes. I thought about Katherine Harrington's note, "Some systems benefit from shocks," and how perfectly that described what had emerged from the collapse of my marriage. The technical term was anti-fragility, the property of systems that don't merely withstand stress, but actually become stronger through exposure to volatility, randomness, and disorder. It was the perfect metaphor for my journey. Richard's betrayal had been intended to diminish me, to extract value while leaving me depleted. Instead, it had catalyzed a transformation that would have been impossible without that precise stress applied at that precise moment. The lesson wasn't that trauma is necessary for growth, a dangerous oversimplification, but that our response to disruption determines whether it diminishes or strengthens us. The choice between fragility and anti-fragility lies not in avoiding shocks, but in how we integrate them into our evolving systems. As the storm began to abate, stars appearing between breaks in the clouds, I felt a deep sense of completion. Not because the journey was over there, would always be new challenges, new horizons, new opportunities for both growth and regression, but because I had internalized its central lesson. True power isn't measured by what you can take from others or do to others, but by your capacity to create value aligned with your deepest principles. True wealth isn't accumulated possession, but expanded possibility. True victory isn't triumph over others, but the freedom to define and pursue what matters most without distortion by either fear or obligation. In the most meaningful sense, I hadn't just survived Richard's betrayal or even thrived despite it. I had transformed it into the catalyst for a life far more authentic, impactful, and aligned than would have been possible had he remained faithful to our marriage. That transformation from victim to strategist to creator was the victory that mattered. Everything else was just details. The woman who had once been defined in relation to Richard Harrington now existed entirely on her own terms, creating value according to her own vision, navigating complexity with hard-won wisdom. And that was $1 billion education worth every penny.